Hey, welcome back. This is another one of those videos that start with me hauling what looks like a bunch of junk around, and on some level that's true because all of these bike frames have been discarded by their previous owners because they suffer from the same issue. No, it's not that they're blue, that's just a weird coincidence. What I'm talking about is probably the most dreaded issue in all of bike maintenance, and that is seat posts getting stuck inside the frame. And when I say stuck, I mean really stuck. If you've never encountered this issue, it might be hard to imagine just how seized up a seat post can get, but the fact that people are willing to abandon their frames because they see no other solution should give you a hint. The very first thing people usually try when they realize their post is stuck is pretty obvious. They start twisting and pulling on the saddle in order to get it to move, but of course this doesn't work on any but the most harmless cases. From this point on, things tend to escalate, and oftentimes these frames will tell you a whole story if you look at them carefully. This frame here is a pretty good example for that. If we look closely here, we can see that someone has already damaged the end of the seat tube, which is quite common because the next move is often to grab a screwdriver and start prying around at this slot here. This potentially damages the frame while achieving absolutely nothing, because when you release the clamp and your post is still stuck, your problem isn't up here where the clamp is. Your problem is actually down here where the post is seized inside the seat tube along its entire length of insertion. So trying to loosen it down there by prying up here is pretty much pointless and will only damage your frame. The next common move is using a whole assortment of pliers, pipe wrenches, clamps and other torture devices to try and twist the post loose, which again usually does nothing except for mangling up the top of the seat post even more, and looking at the state of this when I got it, all these bite marks tell us that's exactly what happened here too. So far these methods were all either pointless or counterproductive, but I want to show you one that can actually work. A common solution for moderate cases is to hold the end of the seat post in a sturdy vise and then use the frame itself as a lever to try and twist it loose. In some cases this can be enough to break the initial bond between the tubes and start to get things moving, but needless to say, on all of my test frames here, the posts are so hopelessly stuck that if I twist them any harder, I risk actually deforming the frame itself, so I'd only recommend using this method with some caution. Once all these methods have failed, some people tend to get really stubborn, and this often spirals into ever more frustrated and inappropriate attempts at removing the post, with increasingly stupid methods like trying to hold a round tube in a vise with flat jaws and ending up crushing it, or drilling holes into the post to insert some kind of twisting bar. But you can only exert so much force onto an aluminum tube before the tube itself starts to fail, and that's how you end up with really tragic cases like this GT frame here. With this one, someone seems to have escalated their attempts at removing the post to the point where it completely ripped apart. Then they tried prying out the remains somehow, which also deformed the top of the seat tube, and seeing this really pains me because this was a pretty cool frame and it probably could have been saved with the right methods. So if you take away anything from this video, just please don't be that guy and stop and use your brain before it gets to this point. So the big question is, how the hell does this even happen in the first place? The short answer is neglect and a lack of maintenance, but the more technical answer is corrosion. Stuck seat posts can occur with any material combination, but aluminum seat posts and steel frames are the most notorious for this. When you install a seat post and you don't use enough grease or none at all, water can creep into the tiny gap between the seat post and the seat tube, and it starts to cause both the steel and the aluminum to corrode and also chemically react with one another. The aluminum starts to form aluminum oxide, which expands and fills up the tiniest of gaps between the two tubes, and at the same time it also bonds with the rust from the steel tube, and this creates an incredibly strong connection between the two materials, which can require an insane amount of force to break, which you simply can't generate with any of the methods I just showed you. The good news is this whole situation is super easy to avoid by simply making sure you have enough grease on your seat post, but the bad news is once this problem has gotten really severe, it can seem next to impossible to fix it, which finally brings us to today's build. Today we're going to be building a device which is capable of rescuing these frames by safely extracting the seat post while keeping the frame and in most cases even the seat post 100% intact. I didn't invent this type of device, I have no idea who built the first one, but similar ones have been around for decades, so this is just my take on it, and as far as I know, no commercial product exists to counter this problem, so building it is kind of the only way to get your hands on one. The whole thing basically works like a big inverted vise. You turn this big nut on top, which drives the spindle and pulls up these plates, which in turn pull out the seat post. At this point I would normally show you a bunch of additional animations of the CAD model and ramble on about how everything works in detail, but this introduction is already so long that anyone who's ever used TikTok has probably stopped watching 4 minutes ago, so let's just jump into the build and I'm going to show you how it works at the end. So let's start by making the frame. I'm cutting the two side tubes to length here, and then they go on the mill to drill the hole where the bottom bracket axle will be inserted later. Next up is what I call the bridge. This is a pretty hefty piece of tubing because it's the one that sits on top and has to withstand the pressure generated by the spindle, which will go through the hole I'm drilling here. With these workpieces prepared, we can already start welding up the frame, and as usual, since people often freak out when they see this table, I want to make it clear that by no means do you need a super fancy welding table just to build a simple steel frame. It just makes things a bit more convenient. I'm using these spacer blocks in the center here to make sure the side tubes are parallel, and then also putting some spacers underneath the smaller tubes to get them to the same height as the bridge tube. And then everything gets aligned by just putting slight pressure on the clamps and a few taps with the hammer to get everything snugged up. I also cut a tube for the bottom here, and now it's time to weld this up. So as you can see, the basic frame is pretty simple. I don't know about you, but watching me run all those welds seems kind of boring. So how about we pass the time by hearing about today's sponsor, Incogni. If you're anything like me and you've also been chronically online since the 90s, you've probably wondered more than once how the hell all these people that are sending you spam mails, fake calls and phishing messages on your phone have gotten your contact info in the first place, and why online advertisers seem to be able to read your mind nowadays. I've never given it much thought myself. I kind of just assumed that people get your data from shady sites on the darknet or something. But I wasn't aware that there's literally an entire industry out there which is based on obtaining and selling all of our personal data. If you're watching this, I can almost guarantee that there's at least a handful of companies that are selling your data without permission right this second, which you have every right to be pissed about. The good news is, if you send them a request that they stop and delete your data, they're legally obligated to comply. The bad news is, for the average person, it's almost impossible to figure out who has your data in the first place, how to contact them, and how to make sure they comply. And that's where Incogni comes in. Incogni is a service that you can simply sign up for, and they will do all the work of finding out which data brokers are selling your data and getting them to stop doing it while you can sit back and relax. All they need is your name and email address, and then it's just one click for you. When I first signed up, I was shocked to see that at least 43 companies are using my data against my will, so it's no wonder why my non-existent sons keep getting into financial emergencies, or that apparently I have 87 packages waiting at the post office that are going to be lit on fire unless I send DHL the password from my bank account. That being said, getting spam is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to data brokers, but as long as you sign up with Incogni, they will continually send removal requests to these companies to make sure your data is not only deleted once, but stays off the web for good. If you sign up to Incogni right now using the code Vandelay, you can get a whopping 60% off an annual subscription, so if you want to take back control of your data, check out the link in the description. And what do you know, I happen to be finished welding right on time, so let's move on. Now I'm just adding some mounting brackets down here, and I specifically designed this so it's relatively flexible in how you can deploy it. The post puller can either be permanently screwed against the floor, or like in my case, it just gets some legs that can be disassembled when it's not in use. Next up is making the two pulling plates, which I'm just gonna make from some hot rolled steel flat bar, which like the other materials is pretty cheap. I think I spent less than $100 on this entire thing in terms of material, since most of it is just mild steel. After grinding up the mill scale, I blued the top surface to put some scribe lines because I like to have a visual reference, even though I'm gonna make the cutouts on the mill. And speaking of the mill, the process I used to cut these shapes was a lot more complicated than it needed to be. You could basically just cut these out by drilling a few holes and using an angle grinder and some files to do the rest. So as usual, I'm doing it this way because I get carried away with the kind of perfectionism that sometimes has very little practical value. But in principle, this part doesn't need to be very accurate to do its job. But anyway, I'm drilling these rows of holes here because it doesn't take very long. It makes it a bit easier on the machine and the tooling to cut slots in there. And yes, of course it would be way easier to cut this on a CNC or water jet or something, but I don't have those machines, and ordering this kind of thing to be cut is pretty expensive in small volumes. So I'd rather spend a few hours doing it myself, which also makes for a more interesting video. With the slots done, I can now cut out the center, and then I'm just gonna clean up the edges on the mill again. I'll admit this was a pretty tedious process, but I'm not sure milling out this entire chunk of material would have been quicker, because it is pretty thick, so there's a lot of steel to be removed, and on a small machine like mine that can take a pretty long time. And speaking of removing material, here's a friendly reminder not to buy carbide end mills on AliExpress. With the cutouts finished, the upper plate just needs a few holes drilled now, and then it's done. For the lower plate it is a bit more tricky because I need to create this cutout, which could be made by just drilling a hole and cutting the opening on one side, but I don't have a drill that big. One option would have been to use the boring head on the mill to enlarge a smaller hole, but you can't really take deep cuts with those, so that would have taken forever, so instead I decided to do it on the lathe. I'm once again using my lazy chuck in a chuck setup, because even after years I still haven't bothered to buy a backplate for this chuck. And since this works fine, at this point I almost don't see a reason to, since the runout doesn't really matter with an independent 4-jaw chuck anyway. Speaking of runout, this doesn't need to be crazy accurate, so instead of an indicator I'm just centering this up by eye. As with the cutouts on the side, none of this is really necessary in the first place, because this cutout too could have just been made with an angle grinder. I just wanted it to look pretty. And now I just gotta cut the opening here so this can go around the seat post and clean up the sides once more on the mill. I almost always get asked what tool this is when I use it, so I'm gonna link this in the description. It's a little air-powered chamfering tool and it's perfect for finishing parts like these. After some chamfering I also cold blued these parts, like most parts for this build. So in case you've never seen this, this is not paint. It's a chemical solution containing acid that creates a black oxide layer on the steel, which in combination with oiling provides a quick and easy finish for steel parts, which protects against rust, at least to some degree. These plates have enough clearance so that they can be installed inside the frame here like this. And with those done, we can now move on to making the big nut on top that drives the spindle. I happen to have a piece of stock that's already got the perfect size, so since this doesn't need any turning on the outside, let's just use that. Apart from the pilot hole for the thread, this only needs one feature, which is this recess, which is there to provide space for an axial bearing that this nut will be running on. Since I expect that in some cases a lot of pulling force will be necessary to get the seat posts out, the bearing is going to significantly reduce the friction and therefore the force necessary to turn the handle, so that should make the whole thing a little bit easier to use. Once the turning was done, I started to cut the thread in there. This is an M18 thread, so it's pretty hefty. I wanted to cut this on the lathe at first, but unfortunately my inside thread cutting tool wouldn't fit for this whole diameter. So I ended up using a tap, which was quite the ordeal, because this is a super cheap tap, and even though it was brand new, it cut horribly, but it did work with some patience. Now we just need to put some handles on it, so I'm gonna cut some miters into these tubes here at an angle, which I'm setting up using the digital angle box there. The angle isn't strictly necessary, but it should make it a bit more ergonomic. Before I started fully welding this, I realized this is a great opportunity to demonstrate how welding distortion works. So I'm putting the angle finder on the tube here, and now watch what happens when I tack weld the other side of the handle. First the handle actually moves down, and that's because the heated steel expands and pushes it away, but then as soon as it cools down, the opposite actually happens. It shrinks back to its original position, and then it actually goes further, and that's why people talk about the weld pulling. This is what happens with pretty much every weld to some degree, and it's what makes it so tricky to keep welded constructions accurate. But for these handles, I don't really care about a few fractions of a degree, so here's the finished part. And like the last one, it got treated with coat blue. And with that done, it's now time to make its counterpart, which houses the bearing I mentioned. This is pretty straightforward too, so not much to say about it, except that once again it's not even strictly needed. You could just put an axial bearing on top without the housing, or just skip the bearing altogether and just use a bunch of grease to reduce the friction. In fact, you don't even need to make the large nut with the handles. You could just use a regular hex nut and drive it with a wrench to keep the entire top of the device much simpler. But when I build a tool like this, I want to potentially use it for years to come, so I prefer to make things a bit more elaborate. And by the way, when I started with this build, I actually noticed the glass scale for the digital readout on my lathe is broken. I couldn't get any reading on the Z-axis anymore, so I'm using some old school machining methods here. I got this dial indicator set up so that the carriage pushes against it, and that way I can see how deep this cut is by watching the revolutions on the small dial there. The bearing now fits in there nicely, so next up this gets attached to the top of the frame, just using a few tack welds because I don't want to risk warping this part, and it really just needs to stay in place, so there's no point in over welding it. Next part are these two cups that go inside the bottom bracket shell of the frame to protect it and fill the space between the frame and the axle that's gonna hold it in place. On other post extractor designs, people often use old bottom bracket bearing cups for this purpose, and that's a totally valid solution. The only reason I'm not doing that is because threading bottom bracket cups in and out is kind of annoying, especially on older frames, and I'd like to avoid screwing things in and out, so with these you just push them in like a plug, which is much quicker and easier. I'm making these from a machinable plastic called POM, which is a softer material than steel or aluminum, so they shouldn't be able to damage the threads in the frame, but at the same time POM is impressively tough. I suspect a lot of you are going to be super skeptical about plastic being able to withstand the huge pressure created by this device, but just wait until the end to see what happens. Next we also need to make the axle. This is super simple. I just bought some 18mm cold rolled steel for this, which already has the diameter that I want, and all I'm going to do is cut 2 threads in the ends to secure it, although it isn't even necessary since it's unlikely to move by itself when it's being pulled up. So here's the finished axle and how the spacers would go on there. The last part to make is a custom collar that clamps around the seat post and provides the surface the plate is going to pull against. It's important that this fits the diameter of the seat post exactly to provide a good frictional connection, so unfortunately this one is kind of tricky to make without a lathe. You can buy similar clamps, but they only come in a bunch of standard dimensions, so you'd have to at least turn the ID to the size that you need. I'm doing something kind of unorthodox here, which is to use a weld-on shank core drill, which is normally used in magnet drills, to remove the bulk of the material from inside this round stock. This clamp will have an inside diameter of 31.6mm, which is the largest common seat post size. There are larger ones, but you usually only encounter those on stuff like modern mountain bikes or folding bikes. But that being said, even if I ever come across one of those with a stuck seat post, I could still make a bigger clamp if I needed, but this one should cover 99% of the usual culprits. What's really annoying about bikes is that there's an almost endless list of different seat post sizes that exist out there, so since it's not feasible to make a dedicated clamp for every single size I encounter, the idea is to use shims for everything smaller than 31.6, which I'm also going to show you in a bit. Now that the turning operations are done, this goes on the mill one last time to create pockets for the clamping screws and cut some threads. And while that's happening, here's the usual service announcement with me telling you that I made a set of plans for this build, in case you want to start rescuing frames yourself. It includes detailed drawings of all the parts as well as the CAD model you're seeing here, and it also contains some improvements I made to the design after testing it, so check the description if that sounds interesting. Now that all the features in this part are finished, it just needs to be cut in half, and then the saw cut surface gets cleaned up on the grinder a bit, and for the last step the threads on the front side are drilled out. Since this was sitting in a slot slightly below the normal cutting surface, the bandsaw didn't get all the way through, so I finished this the old school way using a hacksaw. With that, all of the parts for this are finally done, so now let's put it together to see if it was all worth it. First thing that goes on are these feet, which are just some pieces of tubing that I inserted riv nuts into. I also 3D printed some plugs for the end here to make it look a bit more finished. Now we can install the bearing with some grease, and upon putting on the nut, it's really apparent just how effective this is. Even just a small push makes this thing spin for an impressive amount of time. Next up is installing and connecting the pulling plates. At first I just used these two screws here because I thought they were long enough, but you're gonna see that I later switched these for pieces of threaded rod to create more space between the plates. Now the main spindle can be installed, and with that it's ready for action. Another benefit of the axial bearing is that by spinning the handle you can have the momentum pull up the spindle, which makes getting this thing in the right position a bit less tedious. As a nice cherry on top, I'm also going to add some grips. I was smart enough to pick a size for the handles that's very close to bike handlebars, so I can just put some handlebar grips on this, which makes it look suspiciously close to something Proctool might sell. And now let's finally put this thing to the test. This frame is going to be our first test candidate, and I picked this one because it's the only aluminum frame in the lineup, so I expect this one is going to be a bit easier to deal with than the others. As you can see, the seat clamp is completely loose and the post is not budging, and this one also has one of those shapes that you can't really hold in a vise. It seems to have a 31.4mm seat post, so it's slightly undersized for the clamp I made. I could use some shims from sheet metal, but I figured since it's only a small deviation, I'm just going to try the clamp as it is first and see what happens. Now I am inserting those spacers I made before, and then the frame can be fixed in the post puller and the clamp gets inserted into the pulling plate. Now we can start to turn the handle, and as you can see, the seat post is actually starting to move right away, which looks pretty promising. As I expected, this post wasn't super stuck, but still stuck enough so that it wouldn't come out with the usual methods. When I had this pulled out most of the way, I took the frame out of the device for a second because I was curious to see how stuck it still is. And even at this point, I wasn't able to move this by hand at all, so as smooth as the extraction might look on video, it's actually still seized and they're pretty good. But after a few more centimeters of pulling, I was able to remove it by hand, so it looks like we're off to a good start. And for anyone concerned about this, I also tested the bottom bracket threads before and after each pull, And as you can see, the BB cup still goes in and out without any issue, and the POM plugs also show no signs of damage. As for the seat post, there's no rust since this wasn't in a steel frame, but if we compare the top and bottom of the post, we can clearly see the oxidation that happened there. Those dull gray areas are where the aluminum oxide formed, and that caused the post to become seized, but as mentioned before, this problem gets much worse when there's also steel involved, and that's the case with our next frame, which put up a lot more of a fight. Once again, it's completely impossible to move the seat post by hand, but the head on it does have a shape that lends itself to be gripped in some vice jaws. So I gave it a shot and tried if I can twist it loose, but the frame and post are flexing so much that I think if I push any harder, there's a good chance I might deform the frame. So let's see what the post puller can do. This one has a 25.4mm seat post, so I did have to make a shim for this. And you can actually buy shims like this, but it's relatively quick to make one, so my plan is to just make these myself as I need them. One thing I should mention about the clamp is that I fully expect this to not actually stay in place when pulling severely stuck posts. This is only 50mm long, so if the seat post is seized deep in the frame, it's very unlikely that the friction from the clamp is going to overcome the friction of the seat post, but it's not really a big deal, because even if it slides up, you can always pull against the head of the seat post, which should be able to take quite a bit of force, and even then the clamp will at least reduce the force acting on the head by providing some extra friction. And due to its length and the snug fit, it can also stabilize the tube and avoid creating pinch points and weak spots like many other methods do. As you can see by the marker lines I put there, the clamp is in fact moving up, which is kind of what I expected, since this post is extremely stuck. So I figured I'm just gonna move it up further where it's gonna end up anyway. At this point I encountered a problem that I was also kind of expecting. Pulling this out required so much force that the pulling plate actually started to bend here. I guess it would have to be even thicker because unlike the one on top, it's only connected on one side due to the cutout. But I quickly came up with a fix for that. First I removed the plate and bent it straight again on the hydraulic press, and then I drilled some holes and made this bridge here, which just screws on to add a lot of support on the open side. With that we can get back to pulling now, and sure enough this added enough strength to finally beat this post into submission, as evidenced by the first cracking sound. I don't think it really comes across on video just how violent those releases of tension are, so maybe the slow motion helps a little. Once the initial stiction has been broken, it usually gets a lot easier, but this still took some elbow grease to get out. So here we can see what a really bad case of stuck seat post syndrome looks like. This layer of oxidation was pretty bad, and as you can see, this stuff that's flaking off here has some real volume to it, and that's what forms that incredibly strong bond. Since this one took a huge amount of force to get out, I was just curious what the condition of the post and frame is now. And the top of the seat post looks pretty much unharmed, except for the sticker peeling off. Here's a closer look at the nastiness on the bottom, but as bad as this looks, I think this post is still usable, so I tried cleaning it up just for kicks. I'm using a nylon wheel here, which shouldn't damage the aluminum, to remove the rough stuff, and then some sandpaper and Scotch-Brite to clean up the rest. And I don't know about you, but I would still ride this thing. As for the bottom bracket, the spacers once again look completely fine, and just like last time, a BB cup still threads into the frame absolutely fine, so that's further proof that this method does not damage the frame in any way. Next up is this frame. This is your classic old steel frame road bike, and these are notorious for having this stuck seat post issue. Again, looking at the top of the seat post, we can see someone already had a go at this, and it shows the usual signs of desperate removal attempts. But luckily whoever tried that gave up before it got too far. What surprised me about this one is that it looks relatively well maintained from the outside, but when I took this bike apart I realized whoever put this together has apparently never heard about grease in their life, because the bottom bracket was seized really bad on this one. I had to use the largest wrench in the shop to get this loose, and the inside was completely devoid of any lubricants and just filled with this rusty powder you can see me remove here. So if the seat post was treated the same way, that really explains everything. As with the last frame, I made a custom shim for this post, so now let's see if we can get it out. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough space to install the support I used for the last frame, so I figured it'll have to work without it, and luckily it did. Again, the clamp kept sliding up here, but that's not a big deal, and after those initial violent cracks, this started to come out nicely. And what I think exacerbated the problem in this case is that this was a super long seat post which never seemed to end. This thing was inserted almost 30 centimeters deep into the frame, which coupled with the amount of corrosion here explains why someone gave up on this. I really think there would have been no other way to remove this other than a specialized device like this one. And once again, except for some scratches, the top of the seat post seems pretty much unharmed, and the same goes for the bottom bracket shell. The next frame is the very first one I showed you. That's the one that got really messed up by the last person who tried to remove the post. And this frame is also cracked at the chainstay, so while it could be fixed, this is pretty much junk, and I'm just pulling the posts out for further testing. I also want to mention that when trying to remove seat posts, it always makes sense to use some penetrating oil first, both from the top and also spraying it on the inside of the seat tube through the bottom bracket vent hole. I did this on all the frames I showed you, but with the very severe cases, it tends to not really get in there when all the gaps are fully sealed, but it definitely can't hurt to try. This one was a bit harder to get out than the first one I showed you, but much easier than the other two. And I think this might be because on this one the oil actually did a very good job at getting to the rust, which has started to dissolve here. And for the last frame today, I got something really special for you. This is a carbon fiber road bike that belongs to a friend, and he's not riding this anymore because it too has a stuck seat post. After everything I said about grease and corrosion, this might come as a surprise since neither the frame nor the seat post on this are even made of metal. But carbon posts getting stuck in carbon frames is actually not that unusual and can be caused by things other than corrosion, like dirt and water creeping into the gaps. What makes this one especially tricky is that it's also not a round seat post. This has an aerodynamic shape, so it's impossible to twist this loose, which means the only possible way to remove this is by pulling, and I think that's the main problem here. I suspect that this isn't even that stuck compared to the other frames I tried, but nobody was able to get it out because there's really not much you can try except pulling on it with your hands, and it's definitely too stuck for that to work. But maybe it can be removed by hand if the frame itself doesn't move around so much, so let's try putting it in the vise first. I really wish I could see some of your faces just now, but of course I'm joking. Putting clamping pressure on a carbon frame is a huge no-no, so now let's try to actually rescue it. Besides the fact that I'm obviously not going to be able to put the clamp I made on this thing, it also has a different type of bottom bracket. This is a press fit BB, so the BSA adapters I made aren't going to fit, but that's not a big deal because I can just make some custom spacers that fit in there. I'm not going to bother to remove the bearings because I don't think pulling this will be violent enough to cause any damage, and I'm sure something else would break before those anyway. Here's the adapters I made, so now let's see if this post is going to come out. Since I can't use the clamp, I figured the next best thing is to pull against the saddle mounting bracket here. After all, this is what takes all the weight of the rider, so it should be somewhat sturdy, and in order not to damage anything, I just cut 2 strips of plywood to put in between. Due to the shape of the post, it just started pushing those away and sliding out of the opening at first, so I just clamped an additional piece of wood there to keep it from doing that. And sure enough, this kept everything in place and the post started to come out. This one really didn't require much force at all. There was almost no resistance in the handle compared to the steel frames. So the fact that nobody was able to get this out was mostly due to its shape and material, as I suspected. And I'm really glad nobody actually tried putting it in a vise, because after some cleanup this frame should now be good to ride again, which given its value makes this success even more satisfying than the clunkers I saved previously. And with that we're at the end of this video. All I can say is that this is already one of my favorite builds so far. There's something intensely satisfying about saving these frames, and it warms my heart to know that this device might be able to give hundreds of frames a second life during its lifetime. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember guys, put grease on your seat posts, don't leave your bikes in the rain if you can avoid it, drink enough water, and like and subscribe, and see you next time.